We often talk about the pain of losing someone, but what we rarely talk about is what happens to the person who pushed them away, especially when that person is an avoidant. You might think they move on easily, but the truth? Losing someone who actually cared, someone who saw them, stayed, and tried, shatters the very armor they built to protect themselves, and that's when the unraveling begins. Avoidants often operate from a place of deep fear, fear of being engulfed, fear of being controlled, and most of all, fear of vulnerability. They've learned somewhere along the line that letting someone get too close is dangerous. So when someone genuinely cares about them, the very thing most people crave becomes, for them, a threat. That care feels intrusive. Attention feels overwhelming. Emotional intimacy feels like someone reaching into their carefully protected space. And when you live with that lens, genuine acts of love can be mistaken as attempts to control. This isn't something they do maliciously. It's how they've learned to survive. Somewhere in their past, they experienced closeness as something that came with conditions, expectations, maybe even manipulation. So now, even the most innocent gesture of love, a partner checking in, asking how their day was, offering help, can feel like someone trying to take something from them rather than give. They brace themselves even when there's no need. They pull away even when the person in front of them is just trying to get closer because they care. It's not that they don't recognize care, it's that they don't know how to sit with it without panicking. Imagine someone who's spent years living in a locked room. One day, someone knocks, not to break in, not to force their way through, but simply to offer warmth, connection, understanding. That knock, to the avoidant, doesn't feel like kindness. It feels like danger. Their mind runs through 100 scenarios. What do they want from me? What are they going to expect? How do I keep this from becoming too much? They start to question the motives of the one knocking, even if there are none. It's not logic, it's protection. And the tragedy is, they end up pushing away the very thing they secretly want. The person who cares starts becoming the enemy, not because they've done anything wrong, but because they trigger the avoidant's deepest discomfort, being seen, being known, being depended on, and having to depend in return. It's safer, in their world, to keep relationships at a distance. To operate within transactions, surface-level banter, and casual involvement. So when someone actually shows up for them, when someone stays during the silent spells, when someone offers unconditional care, they don't know what to do with that. They begin to misinterpret love as pressure. Support feels like obligation. A desire for closeness starts to feel like someone trying to take control. They read between lines that aren't there, and over time that care begins to feel suffocating, not because it is, but because their internal system is allergic to what they haven't yet made peace with. They begin withdrawing, creating space, justifying why they need more time alone, why they're better off without emotional demands, why relationships are too messy or dramatic. All the while, the person who cared starts to feel more and more like a burden, when in reality they were just present. That care wasn't control, it wasn't manipulation, it wasn't force, but the avoidance filter turned it into something else, something threatening, something to escape. And once the avoidant is pulled far enough away, it becomes easier to paint the whole connection as flawed. They'll focus on little things, tiny arguments, personality quirks, timing issues, as the reason it didn't work. But deep down, it was that they never learned to feel safe with love. And that's the heartbreaking part. The person who genuinely cared wasn't trying to change them, control them, or make them someone they weren't. They were simply trying to love them in a way that was real. But to the avoidant, real love is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar to someone who's spent years avoiding emotional intimacy feels threatening. So they retreat, they shut down, they build walls higher. They start to devalue what they had, not because it wasn't valuable, but because convincing themselves it wasn't makes it easier to justify leaving, makes it easier to feel safe again. This is how avoidants end up alone, not by accident, but by mistaking care for control again and again. They leave relationships that had depth because they were never taught how to handle depth without drowning. They walk away from love that didn't ask them to be perfect, just present, because presence is more vulnerable than any flaw they could ever show. When someone with avoidant tendencies ends a relationship or causes it to end, the initial response often looks like relief. They breathe out, they feel lighter. The emotional demands, the vulnerability, the expectations they found difficult or even suffocating are suddenly gone. There's no one texting to ask how they feel, no one waiting for emotional intimacy they couldn't give, no one standing at the emotional doorway asking them to open up just a little more. On the surface, this relief makes sense. They've spent the relationship feeling the weight of proximity, of closeness they weren't ready for or didn't know how to manage, and now that weight has been lifted. What no one sees, and often what they themselves don't even recognize yet, is that this feeling is temporary. What they interpret as peace is often just a break from emotional accountability. But peace without connection eventually turns into emptiness. In the early days after the loss, the avoidant may convince themselves they made the right decision. They may even believe they're better off. They tell themselves the relationship wasn't quite right, or that they weren't meant for deep relationships, or that they just need to focus on themselves. And these beliefs are easy to hold on to when they're distracted, throwing themselves into work, fitness routines, hobbies, social events, anything that keeps them from feeling the absence, anything that fills the space with noise. But the distraction only works for so long, because at some point they come home to silence. They wake up with no message waiting, no voice reaching out to ask how they slept, no presence checking in on their world. And in that quiet, the very thing they feared, emotional vulnerability, sneaks back in, not through intimacy, but through isolation. The relief begins to dissolve the moment they realize no one is still reaching for them. That familiar feeling of someone being in their corner, someone who offered care even when they pulled away, someone who was there not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. That's gone, and it's not coming back. That absence isn't just noticeable, it's jarring. Because for avoidants, who are used to keeping people at a safe distance, there's often still a sense of safety in knowing someone's on the other side of the wall, trying. But when that someone finally stops trying, when they finally walk away and stop reaching back, the avoidant begins to feel the full weight of their own emotional isolation. This is when the second wave hits. The silence that was once so comforting now becomes deafening. The space they fought so hard to create feels cold. They scroll through their phone and there's no one to share a moment with, no one to tell about the strange thing that happened during their day, no one to mirror back care or presence or affection. The daily check-ins they once saw as invasive are now absent, and with that absence comes an ache they didn't expect. They may not call it loneliness. In fact, they might resist naming it at all. But it shows up in their restlessness, in their inability to focus, in a strange sense of discomfort they can't quite place. And what's really happening is that the connection that once grounded them, that they silently counted on even while resisting it, is no longer there to hold them. Even their favorite distractions lose their luster. The activities that once gave them relief now feel dull. The temporary highs fade faster. Socializing feels forced. Work feels hollow. And eventually, they may begin to remember the little things, the small gestures that once irritated them, the way their partner checked in too often or wanted to talk at the end of the day, start to replay differently in their mind. Those moments no longer feel like obligations. They feel like warmth, like presence, like love. And for someone who has spent so much of their life avoiding emotional risk, this realization doesn't come with clarity. It comes with confusion. They start to wonder whether they made a mistake, whether they misread the whole situation, whether they mistook care for pressure, love for burden, intimacy for threat. But even then, reaching back out feels dangerous, because they would have to confront the reasons they pulled away in the first place. They would have to admit they pushed someone good away, not because that person was wrong, but because closeness felt too right. And for someone who's built their emotional safety on distance, admitting that becomes a threat to the very structure they rely on. So they sit with the emptiness, pretending it's still peace, pretending it's still freedom, pretending they're fine even as the quiet begins to grow louder and the absence begins to feel more permanent with every passing day. For someone with avoidant tendencies, independence isn't just a value, it's a shield. It's the framework through which they've learned to navigate the world safely. The belief that they don't need anyone, that they function best alone, that emotional self-sufficiency is not just a strength but a necessity, becomes central to their identity. This illusion of independence is reinforced over time by a pattern of keeping people at arm's length, avoiding emotional entanglements, and interpreting closeness as a potential threat to their autonomy. So when they lose someone who genuinely loved them, who showed up consistently, who offered emotional connection without trying to control or fix them, the pain they feel doesn't just come from the absence of that person. It comes from the collapse of a belief system they've relied on for years. When someone who actually cared walks away, it forces the avoidant to confront a truth they've spent a long time avoiding, that they are not untouched by love, that connection does affect them, and that underneath their armor is a very real desire to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen. For so long, they've told themselves they don't need deep relationships to be happy. They've justified walking away by repeating that they're better off alone. They've pushed people away with the idea that needing others is weakness, that being close to someone invites chaos or hurt. But the moment they lose someone who was emotionally safe, someone who didn't demand perfection, someone who didn't leave at the first sign of distance, the illusion starts to crumble. And what they're left with is a reality they haven't prepared themselves for. The independence they held so tightly begins to feel more like isolation. The silence that once felt like control begins to echo. They realize that their version of freedom came at the cost of intimacy. They were free to avoid vulnerability, but that freedom also meant losing out on moments of real connection, comfort, and love. The very thing they thought was protecting them has now become the thing that left them completely alone. And the realization doesn't come in one dramatic moment. It unfolds gradually in the quiet minutes when they reach for their phone and realize there's no one to share their life with. In the small moments when something good or bad happens and there's no one they feel safe enough to tell. In the empty space where someone once existed who genuinely cared about them. What begins to sting isn't just that the person is gone. It's that they didn't know how to accept the love that was given to them. That they misunderstood the presence of that person as pressure. That they prioritized space over connection, thinking they were preserving themselves, when in reality they were distancing themselves from the very thing they needed. And once that love is gone, once the other person stops reaching out, stops waiting, stops hoping they'll come around, something breaks inside. The belief that they were fine alone starts to feel hollow, because now in the aftermath, they can't stop thinking about the warmth they used to resist, the kindness they once minimized, the intimacy they now miss. The avoidant begins to see how much they lost, not just in the relationship, but in the opportunity to experience real closeness. They remember the ways that person cared, the ways they stayed, the times they offered patience instead of pressure, grace instead of judgment. And slowly, they start to understand that the independence they clung to was never truly independence. It was fear. It was a defense mechanism. It was a wall built around the parts of themselves they didn't want exposed. And now that wall has become a prison, one they built themselves, one they locked from the inside. Even then, it's not easy to admit, because to acknowledge the illusion means confronting the reasons they created it in the first place. It means looking back at their past, at the wounds that taught them love wasn't safe. It means owning the fact that someone once tried to love them well, and they couldn't receive it. Not because the love was flawed, but because they were too afraid to let it in. So they return to the structure of independence, even when it no longer comforts them, even when it no longer feels like strength. Because dismantling that structure would mean opening themselves up to the very thing they were trying to avoid all along, vulnerability. And without that person there to reflect back warmth, patience, and safety, the avoidant is left alone in a reality where their illusion no longer holds. For someone with avoidant tendencies, memories don't always feel like nostalgia. They often feel like intrusions, uninvited reminders of something they didn't fully allow themselves to experience in the moment. During the relationship, avoidants often stay emotionally guarded, keeping their partner at a distance even while physically present. They downplay the depth of connection, intellectualize emotional moments, and convince themselves that they're not as invested as the other person. But after the relationship ends, especially when it ends with someone who genuinely cared, those memories start showing up in unexpected ways. And when they do, they don't just bring emotion, they bring disruption, emotional landmines that detonate without warning long after they believe they had moved on. These memories don't arrive like a highlight reel. They arrive like flashbacks. A certain song plays in the background and suddenly they're back in the car on a late night drive with that person beside them. Someone who was patient, someone who reached out even when they were distant. A familiar restaurant triggers the image of shared meals, quiet moments, laughter they never fully let themselves enjoy. A simple scent, perfume, cologne, food, pulls them right back into the arms of someone who once loved them even when they couldn't reciprocate in full. In the past, they may have dismissed these moments as just another scene in a casual connection. But now that it's over, those moments aren't casual anymore. They're weighted, they're emotional, and they hit harder because they realize, in retrospect, what they had. Avoidants often believe that emotional distance during the relationship will protect them after it ends. They think that by not getting too close, they won't hurt if it falls apart. But what they don't account for is how memory works. The heart doesn't need permission to remember. It doesn't ask whether they fully showed up during the relationship before deciding to replay a memory. And when it does replay it, it doesn't filter it through the logic they use to justify pulling away. It plays it back in full color with the emotion they weren't willing to feel at the time. So instead of protecting them, the emotional distance they maintained ends up haunting them. Because now they remember all the love they couldn't receive, all the kindness they couldn't hold, all the connection they kept at bay, and they feel it all at once. What makes it even more difficult is the unpredictability of it. They can go days, even weeks, feeling like they've moved on. Then suddenly, without warning, they're overwhelmed. It's in the middle of a normal day, maybe while folding laundry or walking to work, that a memory ambushes them. And it's not just the memory itself, it's the feeling of regret, of missed opportunity, of knowing that someone once made them feel seen and they couldn't meet it. They didn't have the tools, or the courage, or the emotional language, and now that person is gone. Not angry, not waiting, just gone. In those moments, they start to question everything they believed about the relationship. The excuses they gave themselves to justify creating distance begin to sound hollow. The complaints they used to mentally tally against their partner start to fade. What remains is a series of emotional snapshots, moments of care, support, presence that now feel incredibly rare and irreplaceable. They remember how that person stayed, how they didn't walk away when things got quiet or complicated, how they kept trying even when met with emotional walls, and now those walls echo. The hardest part for the avoidant isn't the memory itself. It's what the memory reveals. It shows them the emotional gap between who they were and who they needed to be in order to sustain something meaningful. It holds up a mirror to the emotional withholding they convinced themselves was necessary. It exposes the cost of staying safe at the expense of being real. And because these landmines are tied to genuine care and love, they're not easily neutralized. They don't fade with distraction. They linger, they come back. And every time they do, the avoidant is faced with the reminder that they didn't just lose a person. They lost moments they can't get back. Over time, these memories begin to shape how they see future relationships. They may start to recognize patterns they once denied. They may start to understand how their defenses don't just protect, they also isolate. But in the immediate aftermath, what they're left with is a landscape of emotional landmines scattered across their day-to-day life, reminding them not just of what they had, but of everything they weren't ready to receive when it was right in front of them. Regret doesn't arrive for avoidance in the middle of the breakup. It doesn't come when emotions are high, when decisions are being made, or when doors are closing. It shows up later, quietly, subtly, and with devastating clarity. At first, the absence of emotional responsibility feels like a relief. They're no longer being asked to show up in ways that felt draining or overwhelming. They no longer feel the pressure of closeness or the discomfort of emotional exposure. But then something changes. Not instantly, not obviously, but over time. They start to notice that no one is chasing them anymore. No one is trying to fix things. No one is asking how they feel or reaching out to bridge the silence. And that's when regret starts to creep in. Not because they suddenly want to reconnect, but because they begin to feel what it's like to no longer be wanted. Avoidants are used to being pursued. They often attract people who are drawn to the challenge of their emotional distance. These partners tend to lean in harder when the avoidant pulls away. They ask questions, seek understanding, try to reassure, try to stay. For a while, this dynamic reinforces the avoidant's belief that they don't have to fully participate in emotional intimacy to keep someone around. They're used to being met halfway, sometimes even more than halfway. So when someone finally stops trying, when the calls stop, when the messages go unanswered for good, when the other person stops waiting, it disrupts a long-standing emotional pattern. And that disruption is where the regret begins to take form. It's not always easy for them to identify it as regret at first. It might feel like frustration, like restlessness, like confusion. They might catch themselves thinking about the person more often than they expected. They might replay past conversations, wondering if they misjudged the other person's intentions. They might find themselves scrolling through old messages, reading words they once dismissed or minimized, now seeing them differently. The tone, the warmth, the patience, it all hits differently now. It feels valuable in hindsight, and that realization is hard to swallow, because when they had that care, they didn't know how to hold it. And now that it's gone, they see how rare it was. Avoidants don't regret the ending at first. They regret what comes after the ending. They regret that the person who once stayed through their silence no longer bothers to ask if they're okay. They regret that the door they assumed would always be slightly open is now firmly shut. They regret assuming that love would wait forever, that effort would always be there, that care would keep arriving no matter how many times they distance themselves. And when those things stop showing up, they realize they've lost something more than just a partner. They've lost someone who truly tried to understand them. There's something profoundly unsettling about recognizing in hindsight that someone was the exception, that while they were emotionally guarded, that person was emotionally generous, that while they were hesitant, that person was patient, that while they were pulling away, that person was leaning in. And now there's no one leaning in anymore, no one showing up despite the coldness, no one willing to navigate the maze of emotional walls. The chase is over. Not because the person gave up too soon, but because they gave everything they could and had nothing left to give. This is when the avoidant begins to understand that love doesn't always come back, that people who care deeply can also leave, that you can push someone away so many times they eventually stop returning. It's not about pride or punishment. It's about self-preservation. And in recognizing that, the avoidant starts to feel a grief that's uniquely sharp. It's not just the loss of the relationship, it's the loss of a version of themselves they could have become if they had let the right person in. They see who they were in the relationship, distant, cautious, closed, and they also see who they might have been, present, connected, open, if they had allowed themselves to take the emotional risk. And yet the moment has passed. The opportunity has dissolved. That person has stopped knocking. The messages have stopped coming. The forgiveness that once felt unconditional now feels finite. And with every day that goes by, they start to realize that no one is looking for them anymore. The world has moved on. The person who once made space for their fear has now made space for their own healing. And as much as they may want to reach out, to say something, to undo what's been done, they know they'd have to confront everything they've avoided all along, not just the loss, but their own role in it. For someone with avoidant tendencies, healing is not just about moving on from a relationship. It's about confronting the emotional framework they've relied on to survive, one built on distance, detachment, and control. Losing someone who actually cared doesn't just leave them grieving the person, it leaves them facing the very vulnerability they've spent so much time and energy avoiding. And this is where the real work begins. Because for the avoidant, healing isn't just uncomfortable, it's unfamiliar. It asks them to sit with the exact emotions they've always tried to escape. It demands that they step into the emotional spaces they've built walls around for years. Avoidants often tell themselves that they're okay, that they don't need anyone, that they function best alone. And for a while, this narrative holds. It's reinforced by independence, by productivity, by keeping things surface level. But after losing someone who offered real care and emotional safety, that story starts to crack. They realize that being alone isn't the same as being at peace. That isolation doesn't mean healing. And that silence, while comfortable in the short term, becomes heavy in the long term. It's in this heaviness that they begin to notice what's underneath: the fear, the sadness, the regret, the longing they pushed away when love was present. And now, with no one around to deflect it onto, they have to face it head on. There's no one else to blame. No partner pushing for too much. No emotional demands to reject. Just them and their own reflection. And in that reflection, they often see someone who didn't know how to let love in, someone who mistook care for pressure, closeness for control, intimacy for threat. Someone who learned, maybe early in life, that vulnerability comes with pain and decided the safest route was to never need anyone too much. But now, in the absence of that love, they feel the weight of everything they kept locked away. It doesn't come all at once. It leaks through moments, in quiet mornings, in empty beds, in the sound of their own voice echoing back with no one listening. Healing forces them to stop numbing, to stop running, to stop pretending they're unaffected. But it's not just about feeling, it's about understanding. Understanding where their patterns come from. Understanding why emotional closeness felt so threatening. Understanding how their protective mechanisms kept them from experiencing the very thing they craved. Healing for the avoidant means rewriting old beliefs. It means letting go of the idea that self-reliance is the only path to strength. It means accepting that needing someone doesn't make them weak, that asking for connection doesn't make them less valuable, that love doesn't have to be earned through performance or withheld out of fear. And this realization doesn't come through advice or logic. It comes through pain, through loss, through the recognition that they let something good slip away because they didn't yet know how to hold it. The process is rarely linear. They may try to distract themselves again, dive back into old habits, keep things casual, tell themselves they've moved on. But those moments of distraction no longer feel like freedom. They feel like delay. And every time the memory returns, every time a small reminder catches them off guard, they're pulled back into that space where they have to confront the truth. They didn't just lose someone. They lost the chance to grow through love. The kind of growth that only comes from being seen fully and choosing to stay open anyway. And that's what hurts the most. Not just that the relationship ended, but that they never got to experience who they could have become had they been willing to risk being known. Healing for the avoidant requires choosing to step into the very discomfort they've avoided their entire life. It requires being honest, not just about what went wrong in the relationship, but about their own emotional walls, their own fears, their own avoidance of intimacy. It requires learning to sit in the space where connection once lived and not fill it with noise or distraction, but let it teach them something deeper about themselves. It asks them to stop waiting for someone else to knock on the door and instead begin opening it from the inside, slowly, reluctantly, but with intention, because that's where real healing begins, not in forgetting the person who cared, but in finally understanding why they couldn't receive the care in the first place.